Welcome to today's Energy Central Power Session entitled Maintaining Reliability Despite Rising Extreme Weather Events and Energy Transition. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. We acknowledge that given the higher demands on internet connections where many are working from home, technical issues may be more pronounced. If for any reason we find the need to restart the event, we invite you to join us again by clicking the same link that you'd use to join today. All mics have been muted. If the sound is not clear through your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Today's discussion is interactive with questions from the audience and the moderator. We invite you to submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for making today's event possible. Publicis Sapient was born in the digital age, so they are perfectly placed to modernize and optimize the way energy companies work or even change the business model completely. Thank you so much for making today's event possible. Now I'm happy to turn the floor over to the moderator of today's event, Vanessa Edmonds, to kick things off. Vanessa, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, PJ, and welcome to everyone today. We're very excited about today's power session. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers. I will start again. My name is Vanessa Edmonds, and I'm Executive Director of the Utility 2030 Collaborative. And as PJ mentioned, I will be moderating today's session. I'd like to first thank our hosts from Energy Central and, as mentioned, Publicis Sapient, our sponsor. I'd also like to thank our expert lineup of panelists who are joining us today. They include Ahmed Abani, Vice President of Pacific Gas and Electric, Mitchell Beer, Publisher and Managing Editor for the Energy Mix, Supratik Chowdhury, Director and Industry Principal for Publicis Sapient, and last but not least, James Riley. He is the Head of Research and the CX Incubator Chair for the Utility 2030 Collaborative. During this session, these panelists are going to discuss extreme weather events, the energy transition, and what utilities can do to prepare. Please note that this session includes highlights from a new research paper called Overcoming Threats to Electricity Reliability. At the conclusion of this session, you will receive an email and there will be a link to download the white paper, which I highly encourage. And there will also be a link to a recording for this session so you can listen to it again or share it with others on your team. Let's get started. As most of our listeners likely know, the most recent annual UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, was held in November of 2021. COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, and the summit was attended by the countries that signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty that came into force in 1994. A consequence of climate change, as everyone knows, is extreme weather events, and they have risen significantly over the past 20 years. These include unexpected, unusual, or unseasonal weather at excesses that we haven't seen in the past. Today, I'd like to start with Mitchell Beer. Mitchell did extensive coverage of COP26. Mitchell, what can you tell us about highlights of the summit as they relate to extreme weather events?
Mitchell, I think you're on mute.
That was going to happen at least once. I'm so sorry. Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. The extreme weather impacts that we heard about at COP26 were mostly from the vulnerable developing countries that are really on the front lines of the climate emergency. And that's because so much of the focus of the COP process is on international finance and on international fairness in the way the Paris Climate Agreement is implemented. But as the white paper points out, those impacts are already hitting hard in North America today, and they're going to accelerate. There's a spectrum of views out there on how bad things will get, ranging from very bad to far worse. And so much of what happens in the next 10 or 20, 30 years will depend on how quickly we both decarbonize and build resilience, starting right now if we haven't already started. But the UK Met Office started its week this week with 5 future climate scenarios, and one of those showed the United Kingdom dissolving into warring fiefdoms by 2070. So that's the extreme outer edge, but the UK Met Office is a serious organization and it's a serious projection. Projecting that doesn't mean it will happen. And the good news is that COP26 heard promises from national governments and from other institutions that would bring average global warming down to 1.8 degrees Celsius if all the promises are kept. As you probably know, the bottom line target around the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees Celsius. Being able to glimpse 1.8 in the year 2021 is still a challenge, but it ain't nothing. It's really good progress as long as the promises are kept. And what we're already seeing is that that's a very big if. And we know that the catastrophic end of the scale produces the kind of multiplying disasters that no utility will be able to withstand or respond to, if only because there will be too much going on too close together. One way to bring that question back to the United States, speaking to you from Canada, is to answer the question with another question, and that is, just offhand, does anyone out there know of any state in the US that can spare $80 million a year to deal with climate impacts on utility infrastructure? And I'm asking that because Bloomberg NEF projected earlier this month that US utilities could face annual losses of $4.1 billion per, again, $4.1 billion per year due to climate hazards. Whenever we have to discuss climate disaster risk, I think it's fundamentally important to talk about solutions and opportunities, and we will be getting to that later in the webinar. But understanding and anticipating the risk is the first step in preparing for it, as it is with any kind of risk. And any utility that isn't paying close attention to extreme weather is in for serious trouble on the horizon if they're not already facing it right now.
Thank you, Mitchell. Super tick. So I follow you on LinkedIn, and I noticed a post that you shared last week. It was an announcement from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration about the rising costs of disasters. Do you mind sharing that with the audience?
Absolutely. So first, Vanessa, delighted to be here and talking to you along with a very impressive and experienced panel of speakers. So this new report that came out from NOAA, I think a week or 2 weeks back, it's called $1 Billion Weather and Climate Disasters of 2021. And there are three things that really stood out from this report, especially for me. One was they found that in 2021, here in the United States, we had 20 extreme weather events with losses exceeding $1 billion each. Second, if you adjust for the consumer price index, the average of these $1 billion events was 7.4 in the past 40 years. So every year you were seeing about 7.5 of these $1 billion events. But the annual average for the last 5 years is over 17 events. And of course, last year was 20. So that's a worrisome figure. And I think there's no indication that this is just an aberration. The last important point from this report, at least for me, was that in 2021 you had a full range of extreme weather events. So it was just not just one kind of disaster. You had storms, hurricanes, and so and the big freeze and so on. So what it really means that looking at the past climate data to try predicting what is going to happen in the future is not going to be very easy. There is going to be a lot more unpredictability in the future, and so especially for utilities, that adds a lot of complexity to kind of their models about the future. And then, of course, $1 billion disasters are not so easy to clean up. So as you are seeing more and more of these events, if there are communities that are getting hit more than once a year, that there is genuine concern about the impact that those vulnerable communities are going to face, and that's worrisome for everybody, from policymakers to utilities to politicians and your average person on Main Street. So yeah, I mean, I think this report really kind of underscores some of the challenges that all of us are going to face, and especially utilities is kind of helping power human civilization as we know it.
Thank you for that, and I think we're all very interested to read that report. James, with your experience doing direct utility company consulting, can you talk a bit about the current level of preparedness among North American utilities to deal with these extreme weather events?
Sure. I'll probably talk about one or two incidents that have happened in the recent past and then draw a conclusion from them. So if we go back just to last year and 2021 in Texas, Texas I think experienced 3 severe storms from around about the 10th to the 27th of February. Extreme cold. As a result of those storms, about 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power. Even worse than that, I think generally it's reckoned that about 250 lives were lost both directly as an impact and indirectly as an impact of the storm. And the estimated cost of property damage from the storms was close to $200 billion. Of course, it took some time for the ultimate conclusions to be reached as to what caused the outages as a result of the storm. And there was a good deal of debate in the public domain that it was down to renewables, which account for only 25% of generation in Texas. But the ultimate conclusion was that the loss of power was a direct result of a failure to winterize power sources, primarily natural gas, which accounts for somewhere around 46 to 48% of generation in Texas. So that was a major event that caused a real reliability issue with financial and human consequences. If I jump back another year and I go to my own home state of California, in 2020, we experienced extreme heat, which when combined with people being at home from COVID led to unanticipated and excessive demand. There's some argument to say that the resource planning ahead of this event was inadequate, but one of the real challenges for California at that point was the heat wave was so widespread, it affected neighboring states. And normally California, if they don't have enough generation to meet demand, can wheel in power from neighboring states, but not when neighboring states need that power because they're also experiencing the same heat wave. So California had to institute blackouts, which affected customers. I'll probably come back to this topic later, but certainly that event strengthened the focus and increasing arguments for long-term energy storage, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. And then I'll finish with a kind of a contrast in terms of a very positive story that started negatively. So I live in San Diego and my local utility is SDG&E. In the area I live, we experienced major wildfires back in 2007. Those wildfires killed, I think, 2 people, injured 40 firefighters, caused 10,000 people to have to seek shelter and destroyed about 1,300 homes. After the event, I believe that SDG&E looked at their ability to get insurance against wildfires, and it simply isn't possible. And instead what they did, I think, is invested heavily in their wildfire mitigation and response plans, part of which is a policy of what's called public safety power shutoffs, where in times of significant drought and high winds, particularly Santa Ana winds, SDG&E will actually shut off power from the high voltage transmission lines going over those very arid lands to reduce the risk of wildfire. And we'll come back, I think, probably to this topic. It's been extremely effective. And for SDG&E, they've avoided major wildfires since 2007 as a result of that. So if I kind of stand back and I look at those 3 recent events and some recent successes, we've seen some progress, but I would say in summary, there's still a lot of work to be done by utilities to be properly prepared. And as we've already touched on, with increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, things are only going to get harder.
Thank you for that. And we are definitely all on the phone today because we do know that these events are going to get worse, and we want to give utilities tips for how to make the situation better. Ahmad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you,
Vanessa. Can you tell us how Pacific Gas and Electric Company is dealing with these extreme weather events?
Absolutely, but first, thank you for having me as part of this conversation and alongside this impressive panel of speakers. Also, thank you to Energy Central and our host for sponsoring such an event, trying to combine extreme weather events, the energy transition, and the impact and reliability. Something really near and dear to my heart. To your question specifically, I mean, as utilities always dealt with weather events, and the system we had built and designed and engineered for the past 100+ years was built to deal with weather events based on certain weather inputs, assumptions, patterns, to ultimately deliver certain reliability outputs. But in the recent years, we have seen a big change in the weather inputs in terms of their mainly frequency. How often are they occurring? And some of the panel and the speakers already touched on that. And their scale. What we have seen recently, obviously, point out that the scale in terms of the impact, the effect of these weather events is largely exceeding a lot of even our own internal system designs. Just to quantify the conversation, so first I'll touch on experience on the frequency, and as we are experiencing this here at PG&E, I want to anchor on the probably the reliability metric and how we measure reliability to be able to provide more quantifiable and maybe normalized performance. The IEEE 1336 is the reliability standard, which provides good measure for reliability performance. So we can, measure ourselves and compare it to each other's. And one key measure for the IEEE defines what we call major event days, MEDs, which is an indicator of how many days per year the system experiencing outlier conditions that cause large number of customers to be out, large outages that exceeds in essence the design specifications for the system, for the electric grid, for distribution. And sorry, you're getting some of the engineer in me here, but to be able to quantify that, these events typically driven by weather, most likely. So we started tracking the MEDs here at PG&E back in 1996. Our first 5 year, we averaged 5.8 days per year, with a range from 2 days per year as classified as major event days, and the max was 10. We almost continued to be steady, even improved on that. Compared to the 5 years between 2017 to 2021, we have averaged now 21.4 major event days per year. And the average or the range for these 5 recent years is from 7 to 31, with last year number being at 25 major event days. Just to put it in perspective, the previous 5 year average was at 5.2. So again, we were steady, and then we are seeing a sharp jump in terms of how many days we are experiencing major event days. Of course, these major event days have significant impact on our customers. Customer experiences. Some customers are experiencing multiple interruptions. You heard James talking about also, things related to California here, which I'll touch on it in terms of the scale. But the outside, we've seen it in Texas, we've seen it in the Northeast, we've seen it also most recently in weather events that we've seen here in the northern part of California, with the atmospheric rivers, with heat waves that are happening all through the year. Just to put in perspective, here in California, we used to have very specified and specific wildfire season, typically, late August through early November or late October. The last couple of years, we have seen this season expand to almost the whole year. These also major event days have significant impact on the workforce that now needs to go and restore outages, restore power. We're talking about limited pool of resources across the industry. When you talk about qualified electric workers and linemen and people who can, focus on investing in and working on infrastructure projects, that's now being shifted to really do mostly power restoration. And the cost, which, you heard the numbers, staggering numbers there. Touching on the scale, what we are seeing here, and I know Supratik mentioned in the NOAA's report about how many billion-dollar events the industry sees. But we have seen our fair share here in California. Just to put it in perspective, an estimated 129 million trees have died in California National Forest since 2010, mostly due to condition caused by climate change, droughts, bark beetles infestations. The number of hazardous trees that are along our lines, PG&E manages over 100 million trees in our database that are close to power lines within a falling distance. As a result of that, we've seen the wildfire risks increase significantly, and unfortunately have materialized in a significant number of catastrophic wildfires. Most impactful was the Camp Fire in 2019, caused by our equipment. The Camp Fire was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California's history, caused 85 fatalities. It was, at that year, the most expensive natural disaster in the world. Total losses estimated at $16.6 billion, which ultimately for my company caused us to file for bankruptcy in January of 2019. We pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter on June 16th of 2020. this is real. As a result, we have took a look at everything we do differently. Everything. We are solving every day for this risk, the risk of wildfire. How we plan, engineer, design, operate, maintain, inspect our systems. We file annually with the rest of the California IOUs with the Public Service Commission an annual report on what our plans are. At the end of the year, we come back with what's been accomplished and how we made a difference. And for more details for the the audience on this call, you can visit the CPUC website for more details on the California utilities wildfire mitigation plans. Back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much. So normally we're in the scripted in 2 questions. We're going to open it up for questions from the audience, but we have quite a few good ones related to this topic. So I'm going to do what I normally do and digress a bit from the script and ask you all a couple of these questions. So whoever feels best equipped to answer it, quick answer, maybe 1 minute. The first one here are the costs of wildfires somehow baked into the impacts of climate change / extreme weather? Anyone want to take that one?
I'll take it very briefly and say certainly some of the research I did looking back at 2007 is to get regulatory relief, i.e. to cover the costs of wildfires, it has to be shown that you've not done anything negligent from a utility perspective. There's nothing you could have reasonably be expected to do to prevent that happening. Assuming that that's the case, then basically it's funded by the regulator, which of course what we can't forget means is funded by all of us as customers. So I think the short answer is yes, wildfires where you can demonstrate you've done everything to prevent them from occurring are funded by the regulators, but as Ahmad will know, as a number of other utilities recently know, that's not always the case, and often the bill lands with the utility itself and they have to pay for it.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll ask another one here. So I'm going to read this. It says, as the frequency of extreme weather events increase, how does the utility factor the recovery of costs towards restoration, repair, and recovery? In many cases, these run into the billions of dollars. $3 signs. Anyone have an answer to that one?
Yeah, I can take this one. What we are seeing in the state, and as I mentioned in my impact to PG&E drove the company to file bankruptcy. I think it needs to have a plan. In California here, there was a fund that set aside to really a liability fund for all the IOUs to be part of that. I think we need to look at the regulatory structure in terms of how you put aside some funding that makes sure that one, we can invest in the infrastructure without having that cost all pass through to our customers, and two, be able to provide some insurance blanket in case there's no negligence, in case certain things happen. So California, I think, is a good model to that. We have put in a fund of $20+ billion for all the California IOUs. This is an industry challenge. It's not just a one utility challenge. So that's one approach that's been done here in California that's probably worth looking at.
Yeah, I would just add, a little to what Ahmed was saying. I think it's easier. Utilities obviously need to kind of make sure that, as they're making their filings, for the future in terms of all the capex plans, climate change and the impact of it, is captured, and you're taking measures for it. But the data is showing us that it's a lot more unpredictable. Climate change is real, the impact is real, and it's very unpredictable. And so I don't think it's going to be possible to predict every future that is there. But as Ahmed was saying, I think there are, things that can be done. For example, kind of an insurance pool or so to kind of mitigate the impact that is there on, communities. So, I think it's going to take a lot of people to come together, regulators, other interest groups, utilities, policymakers, to kind of, create that environment where, as we're navigating, our roadmap to, 2050, we are, thinking of all of this.
Thank you so much. And for everyone, go ahead, Mitchell.
Sorry, just quickly, Vanessa, I was just thinking along similar lines that obviously if there's an immediate need, that needs immediate attention. But what I'm hearing from the question and the responses is that utilities need to be thinking about that on both levels. How do we deal with this now? How do we deal with this moving towards the future that will be more unpredictable, but most likely, almost certainly more dire, more expensive? If this is a response that's working now, can we start preparing now for what we're going to be doing when what we're doing now will no longer be enough, recognizing that when that will come, it's not something we can predict, but it's on the way. We're just full of good news here.
Excellent.
Sorry about that.
I want to let you all know that I do see all of your questions here, and we're going to try to get to all of them. We're going to move to the next question now, and we'll address some of these later. If we don't get to all of them, we are going to be sending out an email with all of the questions and answers from our panelists. So have no fear, your questions will be answered before it's over. We now are going to move to another threat to reliability, and that is the energy transition. And Super Chick, we're going to start with you on this one. A lot of people may not be familiar with that specific term. So if you could start by framing by telling us what that is, and then explain to us why that's a threat to reliability.
Sure. Yeah. So, climate change is real. We know it. There is, also, a fair amount of consensus that, there is, the way to mitigate climate change as much as possible is to reduce the reliance on, fossil fuel. Utilities are among the biggest consumers of fossil fuel in the world and they use it for generation of power. So one of the big opportunities for the world to kind of reduce, to have a larger impact, to mitigate the impact of climate change is to essentially, reduce the reliance on fossil-based fuel sources. So what, energy transition really is transitioning the world from running largely or totally on fossil-based sources to renewable sources, which is, not as much as in my view, not as much as a threat to energy reliability, but really a solution to the problem. So, a lot of people think of, renewables are going to come in and that's a threat to reliability. I mean, yes, but you've got extreme weather events on the other side as well. But like all other, medicines, for, which are a solution to the sickness, there are side effects that are there with renewables and, energy transition. And so there are two things which I think are really key here. First is really the impact on the reliability of power supply due to the decline of the dispatchable generation that's driven by, aging coal, natural gas plants, nuclear fleets. We're seeing a lot of retirement of nuclear fleet over the next 10, 15 years. So that has an impact. And, they are going to be replaced by these, renewable, sources of energy. So this drastic loss of capacity is going to lead to, energy supply disruption. So, for example, in Europe, we already experienced it last year, and that led to the bankruptcies of many utilities. And even in North America, I mean, it wouldn't be surprising, given that we also have the ingredients of a possible energy crisis here. The second is the rise of, distributed generation and storage, which is adding more complexity to the grid and its performance. So, we were recently, talking to one of our customers that is an electric system operator here in North America, and they were mentioning about how they're seeing certain events which were far more infrequent in the past, but are gaining more frequency, now, and they're expecting more in the future because of the addition of these newer assets into the grid. Because the grid is no more a unidirectional, network; it's now bidirectional with the addition of these renewable fleets. So I think that's going to add more complexity, and that's going to be challenging. So energy transition, is going to add risks, but it's also part of the solution.
Are you there, Vanessa? I think you might be on mute.
I did it. Sorry for that. Mitchell, same question.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yes, there is consensus that we have to get off fossil fuels by mid-century to the extent of keeping 80% of known oil and gas reserves in the ground. You may have noted the analysis from the International Energy Agency last summer, and then again in their World Energy Outlook in October, which they describe as the gold standard of energy analysis. So lots of expertise and maybe not quite as much modesty there. But the IEA is now saying that there are to be no new oil and gas fields developed because we won't need them, and that in fact through 2050 a gradual and drastic reduction in coal, oil, and gas. So that is very much and increasingly a matter of international consensus. But I would like to change up the question a little bit here on what kind of threat the energy transition represents for reliability resilience, because particularly in light of extreme weather and the absolute need to decarbonize, I think the right question is what it will take for utilities to see the energy transition as an opportunity for reliability rather than a threat. As far as the challenges that we're seeing, that some utilities are seeing today with distributed generation and storage, really the question has to be, for all the reasons we're hearing on this webinar, the question has to be not whether we go there, but how we get from here to there. Yale Environment 360, which is a fantastic information source that I recommend every single day, recently reported on the reliability concerns coming up around the energy transition, and we summarized that story in the Energy Mix earlier this week. The first point coming out of it is that it's standard practice but bad practice based on poor analysis, if not on bad politics, to reflexively blame the renewables whenever there's an outage. But the other point is that no generation source is 100% reliable. And from, sort of one step removed from your industry, it's kind of not my place to be lecturing at you on this, but just briefly, in a more hands-on way than I do, that hydropower capacity is seasonal and it's increasingly threatened by drought. The Yale article also points out that nuclear capacity often falls short, often far short of its reliability target. So that in the end, it turns out that the average customer in the United States in 2020 experienced 5 times the outage period as the average customer in Germany, which is routinely singled out as the jurisdiction that supposedly faces these terrible, dire reliability problems because they dared make a big push towards renewables fast. Now, that 5-fold difference is the difference between 1.28 hours of outage time for the average customer in the US versus 15 minutes in Germany. But those numbers still show that Germany's high renewable grid was among the most reliable in Europe and among the most reliable in the world. But the other question I really think is so important, and we're hearing it both in the discussion and the questions, is how energy transition strategies can help build resilience against a future of increasingly frequent and severe weather events. The white paper talks a bit about decentralization, distributed generation, demand response, but the challenge right now is for utilities to put those options at the center of their energy transition and their asset resilient strategies. And my sense is that there's a variety across the industry, from companies that are embracing it to companies that are kind of trying to hold it off as long as they can. It really is a crucial and immediate need to get on this. I would add just one other category of opportunity, and that is mass deep energy retrofit, because it's a huge opportunity. We have known for decades that the cheapest unit of electricity, the cheapest unit of any kind of energy, is the one you don't need to generate or extract. And yet energy efficiency has always been treated as the poor cousin. It's, almost always, almost universally sort of seen as an afterthought, or sort of the first program we can cut when there's a political change, the way we did in Ontario 4 years ago. But a study in Canada last year found that near zero retrofits for every home and commercial building in our country could, first of all, be completed by 2035 if we organize it right. And secondly, that activity would free up 50 terawatt hours of electricity. And I would sort of try to do my Dr. Evil imitation for that, except that my family tells me I never get it right. But yes, 50 terawatt hours, and nobody's hallucinating this. It's enough to power 10 million electric vehicles with no need for a new supply. The key concept here is that these are not the one-off incremental building retrofits that you're thinking of. First of all, they go much deeper. And secondly, they happen on a mass scale. So that calls for changes in institutions and structures and financing that make the work possible, not unlike the institutional and regulatory changes that may also be needed to help utilities turn the threat that so many of you perceive in the energy transition into an opportunity.
You're on mute again, Vanessa.
Thank you for that, Ahmad. What is your perspective on the same question?
I'm sorry, I may misheard, but if you're calling on me, I think Mitchell hit it right on the head. I won't necessarily categorize the energy transition to renewables in the third category, but we know that in the process of this transition and the utilities, we are experiencing some short-term operational limitations and challenges. The electric grid overall is the ultimate just-in-time delivery machine, balancing the demand and the supply in real time. And while you're trying to do that in an environment where the supply could be intermittent and not as predictable, and the demand in extreme weather events also unpredictable, could present operational challenges. Processes, technologies need to be mature enough to really deal with that. Providing visibility and control to distributed energy resources, I think Mitchell touched on that. That requires a great deal of technology integration, including communication infrastructure. It's not just the utility space. We got also another infrastructure. It needs to be reliable enough during these events to be able to withstand the impact of these extreme weather events and support the electric grid and to be able to operate the electric grid. In the long run, I think these resources, distributed energy resources and renewables, with the proper planning, data, visibility, technology, could provide significant benefits. They are part of the solution to provide flexibility and reliability to the grid. And I think a lot of our industry now practices and processes start baking in these distributed energy resources, renewables, the transition as part of any new whether grid design or any operational procedures. So they are part of the solution, hopefully sooner than later. Back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. James, do you have any other insights not covered by the other panelists on this question?
I think I'd kind of try and summarize a couple of things. So one is, I know we're not debating climate change, but let's just assume climate change is bad. Probably a safe assumption. The increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, very much linked to climate change. And as was said earlier, major burning of fossil fuels creates climate change. Utilities burn a lot of fossil fuels to generate electricity. So we've got a well-established relationship there, and that's why we're looking at energy transition. And you could say without energy transition, extreme weather events are only going to get worse. So we're kind of coming at it from both angles. But as was nicely summarized before, instead of burning oil, coal, natural gas, we need to shift to non-carbon renewable sources, primarily things like wind and solar. And maybe we'll come back and touch on green hydrogen later, which I think is more storage than a source of energy, but we can come back to that. Today, or at least about a year ago, I think the US was 20% of generation was from renewables. Texas was 25%, interestingly. We're 23% from wind and 2% from solar. California was pushing about 34% in total, and obviously more emphasis on solar because the sun shines lots in California. But we've seen reliability issues in both Texas and California, so maybe it's not directly caused by renewables. But as was touched on, the challenge with renewables is the intermittency. And my very simplistic way of thinking about that is, the wind doesn't always blow, and we don't know when it's going to blow and when it's not going to blow within reason. Apart from what I'm told by my fellow San Diegans, the sun doesn't always shine. In some areas it shines more than others, but again, cloud cover can have a major impact at any point in time. In California, the intermittency of the sun creates what's called the duck curve, which is in the middle of the day with the sun shining and a significant amount of solar generation, the actual demand for non-renewable energy drops way down. But as the sun starts to go down and eventually goes down, and demand doesn't immediately fall off until sort of very late afternoon, early evening, what you see is a spike in demand that can't be met. And that's led to the introduction of statewide time of use pricing, which whether you call it an incentive to consume at other times or a disincentive to consume during the peak of the duck curve, is designed directly to try to handle the intermittency. When you introduce more intermittency in supply, which of course with solar and wind you inevitably do, I think the only ultimate answer is to introduce long-term energy storage. But the challenge is there, of course, is battery technology is still prohibitively expensive, but it's coming down in price. And green hydrogen, I think, is a storage technology. It's a way of taking wind and generating green hydrogen, which can be burnt without carbon emissions, and it can be stored as well as using existing infrastructure. I think though that's the hope in the energy transition and introducing reliability. I think pricing incentives, whether you call it time of use, critical peak pricing, they can help, but they're certainly not going to give us the final answer.
Thank you for that. So before moving to the next question, I'm going to take another question from the audience. And Ahmad, I think we'd like to start with you on this one. So the question reads, how much are utilities treating these as urgent problems to solve? How are utility companies partnering with public services boards of different states or federal?
Well, thank you for the question, Vanessa. I think, frankly, and to be fair, we are at different stages in realizing the sense of urgency on this. I think just a couple of years ago, being on multiple discussions as an industry, we're just talking about preparing for climate change, and we found ourselves in our experience, we are dealing with it now. It's not a matter of preparing for, this climate change. It is here. So it's a matter of dealing with it, adapting to it, figuring out what we need to do short-term and long-term. So some utilities probably at different stages of realizing that, because the risk profile is different in terms of the geography, the areas we are in the country. But I see in the last couple of years, people, at least in my case, knocking on our door all the time, trying to learn from the PG&E experience from California, what California went through in terms of wildfire risks. We see now in the Midwest, Colorado, that risk is being materialized. So it's here. I was saving that to my closing comment, but sense of urgency has to be extremely high on this.
And Super Chick, what about among your clients that you work with? The same question.
Thank
So
you.
you are on mute.
I thought I unmuted myself. Yeah. So I would say that, there is a lot of variation in terms of maturity across North America. I mean, there are some areas, some geographies like, California, New York State, which are far ahead, where the regulators are also kind of leading some of these conversations along with the utilities. There are other places where I think the utilities are, trying to be more proactive. So it does, vary across. I think some of the interesting things that we are seeing now is, for example, NYSERDA in New York is coming up with, this initiative where, they're collecting data from all the utilities that are operating in New York State and trying to open it up, to users who can then use that for, in the future for, how DERs should be planned, and, where they should be placed and so on. How do we help disadvantaged communities more, which are more likely to suffer from, the impact of, extreme weather events and climate change. So I think the work that's happening all across does vary, in terms of the maturity. Utilities, I think, are taking quite a, I think, especially when it comes to kind of the East Coast, where they've seen a lot of, storms, or the West Coast, where there have been wildfires, are definitely, taking, I would say, more progressive steps towards it. In California, they're filing a lot more on, their current state of, preparation, and then what they are doing in terms of the future. Similar in New York, in the East Coast, there are a lot of major investments, capital investments that are happening in terms of modernizing the grid. So I would say, the utilities are looking at two major places, the things in terms of investment. One is in terms of the operational technology in the grid. So how do you add more sensors? How do you get a better idea about, the state of the grid and what can be impacted more, and, so on. The other thing that they're looking at is more in terms of communicating with customers. So how do you really get more accurate information, whether it's restoration time or other, information that customers need, back to them. That is something that I think, even comes out in the report that we came out with, is an area where utilities can do a lot more, and is kind of, underserved. So I think those two, I would say, are, where utility customers, that we are working with are looking at, where we are helping them.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to the next question, and we're actually going to start with James on this one. And could you touched on it in your last answer a bit, but the relationship between extreme weather events and the energy transition.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say other than, if the question is there a relationship between energy transition and extreme weather events? Absolutely. If we're not successful with energy transition, we are going to see more and more severe extreme weather events. No question about that. Does energy transition present some challenges on reliability? It absolutely does. And what I would say, and kind of having spent some time looking into this, there's always been a juggling act that utilities have had to perform with respect to juggling supply and demand. A long time ago, it was really just making sure you had enough supply because you couldn't impact demand. Increasingly now, there are mechanisms to impact demand, and I touched on a couple in terms of pricing mechanisms. But when you add more and more extreme weather events and more severe extreme weather events, when you shift the balance of generation towards renewables, that balancing act just got a whole lot harder. And in my simple way of thinking about this, renewables and the intermittency of renewables add uncertainty to supply. On the other side, extreme weather events add uncertainty to demand. You have a heat wave like you did in California, demand for electricity goes up. You have an extreme cold weather event, demand for electricity goes up. So EWEs influence demand, but EWEs also influence supply, and we saw that in Texas. The cold weather meant more people were trying to heat their homes. The cold weather also led to disruption to generation, particularly on the natural gas side. So my short answer, is there a relationship between the two? Absolutely.
Thank you. Super Tick, same question.
Right, coming off unmute. So yeah, I mean, I agree with what James said. I mean, we are seeing the same things, with our customers as well. I mean, I think all utilities now agree that there is a relationship between extreme weather events and energy transition. And I think the key thing is, okay, what's the implication? What do we do about it? And I think that's where utilities are, I think, moving to. I think there's a lot of effort, as I said, earlier, about how do you really get in control of the data that exists. Data that exists in your operational systems and your information technology, on your IT systems around customers and so on. And how do you kind of get it out in front of? How do you use that so that you can empower your field crews, and you can also get the right information over to your customers? I think the big challenge in the industry really is about connecting the asset and worker in the field to the customer, because and it's not an easy challenge, because the data is in so many different systems, and getting that all together and being able to use it to deploy your resources at the right place so that you have the biggest impact, and then being able to communicate that to the customer and letting them know what exactly is going to happen is, I think, really important. Because customers call in and they're not just asking for just the outage information. Sometimes they're asking for, where is the closest center that I can go to, because my house is destroyed or something like that. There's so many things that can happen with a customer, and so utilities need to have all these answers. And the one thing that customers are looking for when there's an emergency situation is certainty. And nobody thinks about a utility during a regular day, right? It's like in the back, it's a background to our lives. But it's only when there's an emergency that everybody's thinking about that. And at that point, utilities have to step up and provide that certainty to the lives of the customers. And I think that's where data is going to play such an important role. And we see it, all of our customers kind of working and investing a lot more on the data side of things.
Thank you. Mitchell, same question.
Thanks, Vanessa. I guess where I see a challenge or a possible risk for utilities is in basically stopping where we are today and saying we're bringing on more renewables, there are grids having reliability problems, and leaving it at that. Because if the sum total of the conversation and the sum total, frankly, of the public message is renewables equate to unreliable, then that takes us down the road, candidly, to new technologies that are not practical, are not affordable, are not ready for prime time, which is riskier still for utilities and their customers. We're just on our way into a fight in Canada now, and we'll see how Canadians fight. You say, oh, very politely. But so I claim. We're just passive aggressive, that's all. But you know, our federal government is just about to introduce a new tax credit based on the Section 45Q tax credit in the US for carbon capture and storage, which is a highly touted technology that is mostly distinguished for never meeting its targets, never meeting its deployment, never meeting its carbon capture level. And the one thing it's really good at doing is going over on costs. So sure, I mean, as an opportunity for utility, that sounds great to me. When do we start? Can we have two instead of one? I would suggest that a more complete and a more practical approach is to say, fine, we know for all the reasons that we're hearing on this panel, and that everybody can see around them every day. We know we need to make this transition. We know that we are in a global emergency and feeling the local and regional implications of it. We know that the solution that is most promising and holds the most potential for us is in some ways not yet fully baked. So if we situate ourselves where we want to be, let's say 2035, because that's the target out there right now for a zero carbon grid. Situate ourselves in 2035 and backcast to today and say, okay, what were the smart things we did in 2022 that got us to the point now where it's January 19th, 2035, who knew? We're all celebrating. We have lots of problems, but the grid is no longer one of them. Yay. So we start by reducing demand as much as we can, because that means we have less supply to provide. So it's back to mass deep retrofits. You know, if we tell ourselves we're going to get all of that done by 2035 and we get it done by 2040, the only reason we'll be disappointed is that we set an even more ambitious target. We've heard a little bit on the, you know, in the paper and on this discussion about distributed resources, about demand response. Nobody's yet mentioned vehicle to grid. But what are the mix of options that make sense in a jurisdiction, and what do we need to do between now and then to get them online? They're not online now for the most part. So what do we do? As opposed to just pausing on the reality that's right in front of us this moment, that is, yes, at times and places there are reliability problems. So what do we do about it? Because I think we're at risk of that initial conversation taking us down a very problematic path if we don't think it through a bit more.
Thank you for that. So we are going to go to another question from our audience, and whoever feels like they want to answer it, you can jump right in. The question is, how do you see a small G&T making the change from fossil to renewables in a cost-effective way?
Vanessa, I'm not sure I heard that question right. Can you repeat that?
How do you see a small G&T making the change from fossil to renewables in a cost-effective way?
We stumped the panel, and I saw this question. I saw this question in the chat box, and I actually think it's a great question, because it's not easy. It's not going to be cost effective. The only way we're going to solve this problem, and I'm kind of jumping ahead to some of my conclusions at the end, is with significant investment. But it's not just a problem utilities face. We all face this problem, and we all, sounding a little bit biblical, reap the challenges if we don't. But you know, it requires massive investment, whether it's investment in energy storage, investment in building new generation capacity, investment in new infrastructure to transmit other fuel sources. investment to make the grid across North America more resilient and interoperable. It's going to require huge investment. So I don't have an easy answer to that question, and that's why I think it's a really good question.
Not an easy answer. I agree. It's a really excellent question, and maybe a couple of pieces of the answer. One would be to mobilize that investment, begin the process of mobilizing the investment. We won't be getting this done by lunchtime tomorrow, but mobilizing that investment from the finance sector that is beginning to actively look for the things that they can do to help drive a transition, the lack of which is threatening all of their other investments outside energy as well. And increasingly, I would say people in the finance sector are beginning to realize that both for pragmatic and PR reasons, they need investments that are real, not greenwashed. So the appetite is there. The conversations need to happen. It won't happen overnight, and that's all the more reason to start sooner. I guess another example, though, about how to, sort of how to organize the investments in those long-term costs. And this is an observation that came out of the Mass Deep Retrofit paper that I mentioned earlier. The critique that I love hearing from one of the authors of that paper is that the problem with the way building retrofits have been done until now, and please listen for the analogies back into the utility sector, the problem with the way it's been done until now is that we say to homeowners, well, sure, I mean, the great news is that you get to finance your own project, but that's okay because you also get to be your own project manager on something and have your house in it for 3 months. Why aren't you talking to us? The change in that report is to structure and consolidate those projects so that the institutional and the financing and the management support are all there. So if it's a long-term investment, let's treat it that way. Let's line up the longer-term financing and all of those resources that are needed to make it work. And I'd be curious to know how that can help clear things and help utilities move from one model to another.
Yeah, if I may offer maybe one additional point, and I think the question around converting existing fossil fuel assets to renewables, I think on the basis of just energy costs and cost effectiveness, the dollar for dollar, it's hard to compete with fossil. Let's all admit it. The reality of it, though, I think with these new asset classes, there's a stack value for not just the energy, but the reliability costs or the reliability improvements, carbon emissions, power quality. We have to start looking at new resources beyond just the energy costs for a dollar for dollar kind of comparison, and look at that all of the additional value, try to quantify those. That's how you make the business case. That's how you start looking at added value, and most probably is going to be more on the longer term than probably the short term.
Thank you for that. So there's another really great question here that's near and dear to my heart because it's something we talk about every day at the Utility 2030 Collaborative. The question is, what and how new technology trends like cloud, security, blockchain can help utilities with resiliency during this energy transition process?
I can probably start, and I think the new technologies mentioned in particular, the traditional grid, the traditional wires, poles, etc., will disappear one day. There's no doubt that renewables more distributed, and the energy transaction that need to happen would require same things that we are seeing today with banking systems, blockchain technology. I can see a world that where energy is not, we are the largest delivery system, and even from how we evolved as an industry from the old days to what we do today with Amazon, the platform that they build on trying to move stuff around, we are moving electrons. And I think when you look at blockchain, that needs to be supported and secured with a lot of the cyber technologies we are seeing. I think the energy of the future is going to be the large platform that allow for that interaction and transactions to take place in a secure fashion. So these technologies and some of our utilities here at PG&E, we exploring that. We're exploring how we can modify our processes to take advantage of first improving in our internal processes, but big picture, big vision. Those are the things that's going to take to build that future energy transactive platform. And I think we can benefit from the banking industry. We can benefit from what happened in other industries, including airlines, to see how that some of these things can be transferable to the energy grid itself.
I think technology is a key element of the answer. If I think about different examples of that, whether it's predictive analytics to look at the likelihood of a storm in advance, the predictive analytics likelihood of wildfire, high winds, drought conditions, etc. Whether it's real-time balancing of what in essence is a supply and demand supply chain, but one that's just getting more and more complicated by the day with distributed energy resources. And I know somebody had asked the question about bidirectional. Now, if I've got bidirectional and I can move power from multiple participants in and out, and I can do that in real time, that will help me to build resiliency. One of the conversations I had with ISO up in Alberta, they were talking about just the complexity of when you've got a shortage of power, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize simply at-risk stakeholders, or do you prioritize things like gas compression companies who might be using electricity to keep the pressure in the gas pipeline to get the natural gas to the generation plant, without which you enter a vicious downward circle in terms of power? And then the challenges of how do I start things back up? It takes a lot of power to restart a generation plant. It's a bit like I don't know if you'll remember the movie Apollo 13, where they were desperately low on power and they had to figure out a sequence to restart things without blowing the battery. All of these are very complex problems. So when you think about cloud computing, you think about advanced analytics, all of these things are going to be necessary for us to better manage and balance an increasingly complex multi-participant energy market in real time, which will help with resiliency. It'll also help with things like why should utilities be paying for energy generated and stored by customers and passed back to them, and how much should they be paying? But yes, absolutely, technology is part of the answer.
Yeah, I'll just add to what James and Emma just said. I think I work in technology and consulting, so obviously technology is part of the answer. But I think what we really need to look at is what are the outcomes that we are really trying to achieve here, in terms of our customers, and what is it that they are looking for. And so for utilities, the way things have operated in the past, those technologies are not going to be the answer for what they need to do in the future. So it's very clear that you need to have newer technologies that need to be adopted. And I think there's a role that regulators can also play in this. We've seen a fair amount of discussion with utilities about how you use cloud within the enterprise, given the capex versus opex sort of argument that goes on. But it's pretty clear that all these technologies, cloud, blockchain, and AI, RPA, and everything, it's all part of the solution for what we need to do in the future. And so I think it's for utilities, it's going to be about the outcomes and how do these technologies help you solve those problems that customers are facing. So being customer centric is going to be extremely key over here.
100%. Okay, we're going to move to the next question. And again, some of this has been covered in previous answers, but this is a good one, so I don't want to miss it. It's how can utilities increase their supply of renewables to reach their carbon reduction goals without compromising reliability? James, did you want to start us off on that one?
Sure, well, I will try. I keep saying storage, and I've also said, at this stage, it's probably still prohibitively expensive to do at large scale, but ultimately storage has got to be a very big part of that answer. It enables you to offset the intermittency risk around renewable generation. I think cross-state infrastructure investment and planning. So if you look at Texas, Texas is relatively isolated as a power grid. So Texas didn't have the ability to wheel in significant amounts of power and distribute it to those customers and those residents and businesses when the outages hit. So I think that's going to be a part of the answer. I think there's an evolving portfolio question as well, and if you look at California, some of the research I did said that part of the reason that we had the blackouts in 2020 was very specialized gas peaker plants that are designed to be able to start up fast and take account of shortfalls in supply when demand unexpectedly peaks, didn't come online as it should have done. And had it come online, we may not have had the outages. So I think there's a portfolio question. We don't ultimately want to be relying on natural gas peaker plants, but as we increase the percentage of renewables, we need to manage the generation portfolio to manage the risk. And then I guess the last thing I would say, and I mentioned it earlier, certainly pricing incentives, disincentives play a part, but I don't think they're the significant part of the answer. So I think it's storage, the ability to spread risk from a geographic perspective, particularly when it comes to extreme weather, which, although the California heat wave was quite widespread, isn't always widespread. The portfolio management from a generation perspective, but I keep coming back to storage. Sorry to sound like a broken record.
And I'm just going to quickly be redundant and come back to efficiency, not instead of anything that James just said, but alongside and ideally as the first step, reduce your demand before you start trying to figure out how to organize it and how to meet the peaks and all the rest.
Thank you for that. So Ahmed, do you have something to add to that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to the question how utilities increase reliability or renewable portfolio to help with the reliability while we are managing through these extreme weather events. And I can offer, in the construct of process technology, real-time data and people, there are multiple things that the utilities can do to make sure that the risk trade-off. So from a processes standpoint, our T&D planning has to be fully integrated. Traditionally, we plan for the transmission system separate from distribution. The resources are everywhere now. Arguably, you probably have potential resources in distribution that can benefit the transmission system. That integrated process for planning, capacity planning, more technical things that needs to take place right now probably need to be looked at separately. From a process standpoint, to be able to also mitigate against extreme extreme weather events, we really have to look at how we engineer out some of the root causes for the impact we are seeing. So predicting and preventing, which is the core strategy for reliability. Reliability at the end of the day is to provide uninterrupted service to our customers and do it safely. So things that we need to evolve as an industry in weather and risk modeling, data analytics to help improve on our prioritization of work, more key and targeted infrastructure investments like system hardening, undergrounding, microgrids, non-traditional wire alternatives need to be considered as well in addressing this problem as well. We mentioned technology, storage. Yeah, but these are new asset classes. Like I said, the utility never really explored the full potential, the full value stack for this, and need to be part of integrating and designing the system. There are also the need for providing a lot more visibility to the distribution grid in particular, more control, things like the EMS systems, the SCADA, DMS, the DERMS, the distributed energy resource management systems, how these resources need to interact, participate with the grid, participate with markets. We are not talking about that these days. There has to be the financial incentive, right? You cannot just have stranded assets, because the more renewables on the grid without the channels and the opportunities to really get the full potential and advantage of it, you potentially put risk in these assets being stranded. The third category, real-time data. We talked about data quality, and the utilities tend to be lacking. I can use other words, but it's not just about the asset data, the accuracy of that data right now. You need to couple that asset data with also real time. that provide grid visibility. Therefore, your SCADA systems, your smart meter data, technologies that are now available, it's there. As a utility, we build the whole business case for smart meters based on meter billing and reading. It's really just scratching the surface. There are so many operational benefits here to provide in terms of real-time data out all the way down to the customer premise, and even in certain cases you can get some information behind the meter. And ultimately, what I would anchor on is the real assets in any utility, in any organization for that reason: the people, the skill sets, the workforce. We need to retool our skill sets. We need to bring in more data scientists, new skill sets in the industry. Our meteorology department, big shout out to that group that provides predictive analytics. Each utility now, most of the utilities we're talking to have a full-time department focused on weather forecasting, near term, long term, and start implementing that as part of your planning processes. So there's so many things that I think the utility is taken back that can increase the adoption of renewables, but it has to be done at a pace where it's not introducing unintended consequences. What I mean by that, things that we've seen, like renewables is not the solution for everything. Renewables adoption and the pace at which needs to also cope with, the technology and the systems, the processes, the resource adequacy there. We've seen it rolling blackouts here in California as a result of heat waves that we relied on intermittent resources that didn't come through. So these things need to also happen in a more coordinated fashion. But I think going back to what I mentioned in terms of processes, technologies, data, and people need to be looked at in order to be able to mitigate the impact of extreme weather events, at the same time use the renewable as a potential solution and a resource and a tool to help with that.
Thank you. Super Tech, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. One is I do think one area that's going to see a lot more attention in the future, especially when you think about energy transition, renewables, and reliability, is microgrids. I think it's still something that's holds that hasn't been operationalized as much, but probably is something that we are going to see a lot more of, especially in light of extreme weather events. It obviously also adds more complexity to the problem. So, it's an interesting thing. But I think that's, from a technology perspective, is something that we're going to see more. The other, I think I would really reinforce what Mitchell said earlier, because, and we were involved in some of the work that happened in, Ontario around the, the demand response programs that were run there. And we saw some very promising results. And I think, one of the reasons, that those programs succeed is because they benefit the end customers. And, if you are talking the right language with the customers, not telling them about kilowatt hours and terawatt hours, because nobody understands that outside of maybe utilities. I think if you can talk to them in terms of dollars and cents and what it means, I think you can actually achieve a lot more. So I think, and there are two parts to it. One is in terms of, just the energy retrofit. There's so much legacy infrastructure all over the world. So how do you make, all this infrastructure more energy efficient? I think is also a big part of the solution, and not just kind of, the technology. The other is, and we've been involved in some of the kind of smart cities that are coming up in the Middle East. And it goes back to, what Ahmed was saying around data. All these smart cities are looking at how they can use data for whether it's demand response, whether it's microgrids, but really being really super efficient in terms of how energy is consumed and how it's generated. So I think, all of these are kind of, part of the solution, and it's all of the journey.
Thank you for that. So we're going to take another question from the audience before moving to our last question that we've prepared to ask today. And then after that, if time allows, we'll get to some of these other audience questions, because this is actually the most audience questions I've ever seen on a power session. So there's a lot of interest in the topic, which is nice. This question reads, much of the success of the energy transition will come down to how well different regions are able to expand their transmission systems. Land use conflicts have made building new transmission so very difficult. In cap. for decades. How do utilities in their respective regions work through this problem sooner rather than later?
Not easily, clearly is the answer. There's no obvious answer. Gosh, I think the ability, as I said earlier, to basically operate the grid more than a statewide level adds resilience that will help us with the energy transition. And therefore will help us with the reliability. I saw another question about why are transmission lines not all buried underground, which piqued my interest. The problem is it's prohibitively expensive to do that. And guess who pays for it? At the end of the day, it's the customer who pays. And that's why that's not been more widespread. But one benefit of doing that would be to reduce the risk of wildfires. When Supratik was talking about microgrids, that sort of piqued my interest, because certainly the challenge that we have in California with transmission lines running over very arid areas with high winds, the answer would be to bury them, but it's too expensive. So maybe it's microgrids that give us the answer. Stop pushing high voltage power lines across such large distances. Push microgrids, push localized storage of DERs out, so that even if you keep the transmission lines, you can switch them off for a period of time, and a community up in the hills in California can continue to operate under power. So we're reducing the risk and we're increasing resiliency in the same way. But I think at the heart of the question that was asked is really politics. And at that point, it becomes really difficult. And I certainly don't have a straightforward answer. Sorry.
I guess I have a question on this, and it's probably a big enough one that there won't be how to answer it on this webinar, but it's this. We've heard, and rightly so, that so many of these solutions are very expensive or prohibitively expensive. Yeah, that's part of the reality. Once we have done all of the demand side things that we can to reduce the demand to reduce the need for, in this example, underground lines, how do we actually calculate the cost? How do we weigh the cost of the underlying of the underground lines against the human economic costs of the Camp Fire or the Dixie Fire? And I don't mean that to pick on California, because it's an issue everywhere. And if that broader cost calculation brings us in some or many instances to a different conclusion, then what financing and regulatory and other structures do we need to take action on that perspective? As I say, we're not going to answer that here, but some of us somewhere eventually have to get there. Yeah.
Here's an example. I mentioned that the property damage in Texas from the storms in 2021, $195 billion was the estimate. The most recent estimate of winterization for the Texas power grid is about at most $20 billion, which would, it's estimated, add $10 a month on customers' electric bills. Only 14% of customers who were asked would be prepared to add $10 onto their monthly bill, which to me says the person who makes that decision is going to be very unpopular.
And my question would be, how would the question asked, particularly in a state, if I may, from the other side of your of our border, in a state that would start out pretty biased ideologically against that kind of change, right? Framing the question might bring a very different answer in that poll.
I just know, as somebody who's sitting in Austin, Texas, and we're expecting a winter storm tomorrow, I'd be prepared to pay $10 right now to guarantee that I had power.
There we go. Is $10 the maximum you'd be willing to pay?
Probably
with that
not.
storm on the way, or a week after it, or a month after it? And how did we frame the question to get that answer?
And we're jumping into a really interesting topic, which Vanessa and I, in Utility 2030, one of our board members asked the question of, should we be actually thinking as utilities about risk-based pricing or reliability-based pricing? And Supratik will relate to this. If you think about in computing the reliability, and you talk about 2 nines, 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines, each time you add, the cost gets significantly greater to achieve more and more reliability. So what reliability should we be providing? And should customers have the option to say, if you let me pay a little bit less, I'm prepared to have more reliability issues. But that's probably a topic for another day. Sorry.
Yeah, and along those lines, we always have to look at the equality of availability as well. So there's some people that just can't weather that extra cost, and so should they have to suffer because of that? So I think that would be a really good power session for the future. I think that's going to be very important. Okay, we're going to move to the last question. We are ending at 3:30 today, so we will go through the last question, and then we'll ask any additional audience questions we have time for. Anything we don't have time for, again, we will get answers and email you all the answers. And in addition to that, some of you were asking for some of the URLs from some of the reports that Mitchell mentioned, and we will make sure that we send those your way as well. Final question. I always like to wrap things up with that final piece of advice. What's risen to the top today? Advice you give utilities who are concerned about growing threats to reliability. Ahmad, let's start with you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Excellent question. And I think you haven't heard any new news in terms of climate change. It is here. It's causing these extreme weather events. It's not a matter of preparing for it. It's a matter of dealing and adapting to it, you know, sense of urgency. So we talked about that one. The good news, in my mind at least, the main fundamentals of the utility business model and our operational model and our mission to provide safe, reliable, affordable, and clean energy to our customers does not change and stay intact. The key is how to best solve for these threats, provide and take the renewables as an opportunity, and provide a balance between these priorities. Make the right trade-offs. Because at the end of the day, you know, utility is still the last resort. I'd love to have, you know, a cost of service model or things that allow the utilities to differentiate. But at the end of the day, as a last resort, you know, to provide power and the last, you know, we have to be able to provide safe and reliable power to our customers, affordable and clean. And what trade-offs you need to make in achieving that goal. That would require innovation. And it doesn't mean that we chasing new shiny objects when it comes to innovation. The best innovation I see in our culture and utilities across the board is, you know, how you do the same things differently, how we look at the planning process differently, how we integrate resources, how we look at technology, right? Utilities have a recent track record in this space. COVID-19 left us no choice. It tested our industry. We proved that we can innovate, adapt, stay reliable and resilient, and continue serving our customers. As we see the inputs to our model, the system in general changing from a weather standpoint, we have to sync up with the outputs, the reliability expectations. Hence, we do all of this for our customers. I think the panel touched on that, but customers' expectations have changed. So we have to sync up with customer expectations, customer needs and community needs are different. So I'll leave you with this, you know, understand these needs, sync up with the customer, set the expectation early. That's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you for that. James, same question.
Yeah, so I think utilities are doing an incredible juggling act, and the juggling act that with the combination of extreme weather and energy transition is getting harder and harder. I think there's a danger that we all underestimate the complexity of what they face, but also underestimate just how successful they've been to date. And we should really stand back and appreciate that. Energy transition is not an option. We have to halt climate change. And we also know that with climate change, we see more and more frequent and severe extreme weather events. So energy transition is not an option, but it is going to require significant investment. And we know that that investment ultimately comes out of the pocket of the customer. What we're talking about is really not just a challenge for utilities. I think it's a challenge for all of us. And my advice would be upfront about the challenge that you're facing as a utility, that we're all facing with respect to energy transition and extreme weather. Share that challenge, communicate that challenge, share what you're doing, what steps and measures you're taking to address that, because after all, I think we're kind of all in this together, and you know, it's not just the utilities problem to solve.
Thank you for that. Super Tick, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, both Ahmed and, you know, James, you know, spoke about the right things. I think for utilities, it's, you know, they need to look at this also as an opportunity. Yes, it's a challenge, it's a big challenge, but it also, every challenge also throws up opportunities that you can take advantage of. And I think for utilities, there are a lot of advantages here, a lot of opportunities here that they can innovate around. So one is, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about outcomes, right? Whether it is, large factories, industries, hospitals, they're all looking for, de-risking, any disruption to their energy supply. So that throws up opportunities for utilities, about whether it is microgrids, storage, whatever other technologies, innovation is available, to come up with, solutions that can address that. So I think that's a big place. It's the same for on the residential side, where, customers are, one of the things we didn't talk about much is EV charging, because in North America, it's really not taken off as much. But once it takes off in North America, it's going to be accompanied based on some of the work that we have done in terms of looking at this market. We're going to see a growth in residential solar as well, because those two are very closely correlated. So there are a lot of opportunities here. When we were working with one of our clients around just some of the adjacent opportunities that exist for utilities around energy transition and reliability. I mean, there were more than 40 different kind of solutions or opportunity areas that we looked at, and where we saw kind of something that was viable. So for utilities, I would say the need is to kind of embrace this and look at, okay, how can we do something more with this. The key, as Ahmed was saying, is making your data work for you, using digital in the right way so that you are able to communicate internally, externally, and lastly, the new ways of working, because it's not just about you can't be using data and digital in the processes that you had earlier and try to think that you want to become innovative. So there is a different way in which utilities need to operate, and I think some of the more leading utilities have tried to approach that. I know at PG&E also there have been major initiatives around how you can change the ways of working. I think that is also going to be really important for utilities. So yes, seize the opportunities that are around you, but also look internally about how you can empower your employees with the right data, the right digital tools, so that they can do things differently, more efficiently and productively in the future.
Thank you. Mitchell, can you finish us out 2 minutes, and then we're going to go back to PJ.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I would say, first of all, set a 2035 plan to hit zero emissions, and crucially, build in the interim targets, backcast from there to today to see very clearly what you need to start in on today to get to that target. Never ever forget that the science is telling us that we need a 45% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and the 2035 target for utilities in the US and elsewhere is a crucial part of that picture. Look for where you can treat the transition as an opportunity rather than a threat. I like to say it's a matter of opportunity and gain, not loss and pain. That doesn't mean it isn't difficult. It doesn't mean there aren't challenges along the way, but look for how you can sort of get that shift in perspective, shift in operations. And if at first it doesn't make sense to you, ask yourself why. We've heard throughout this session that the transition is going to happen one way or the other. And so being ready for it is crucial. And the planning you do today will determine how it happens. And then finally, just a point that didn't come up in the course of the session, but if you get this right, it can also help address some of the customer relationship issues that came through loud and clear in the white paper and that we hear a lot about in the sector. If customers see the relationship with a utility as transactional, and as long as you see it that way, it won't be easy to earn and retain their trust. But if they come to see you as a service provider that is trying to help them do well, trying to reduce their energy costs, cut their emissions, help them weather the next extreme event by anticipating and preparing for it, you just might turn out golden. And it'll at least get you closer to the transition that everybody needs.
Thank you so much to our panelists. This is such a great discussion, and I feel that there will probably be a part 2 on this. PJ, back to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you again to our panel. What a fantastic conversation that we've had today. As mentioned during the event, look for an email from us with the replay and that link to the white paper that we mentioned earlier. And please, if you have a moment, take a minute to fill out the feedback survey that will be popping up as you log off. Give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. I especially want to thank everyone on the panel, all of our audience, and from everyone here at Energy Central. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on another power session. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's presentation.
Okay.